Okay, hello. This is my first tutorial. I've never really done a tutorial before, so please bear with me if I go too fast, if I go too slow, or do anything else that's weird. Um, yeah, so here's what we'll be making. Um, these are basically spheres with a volumetric shader. I used some of the nodes I've been making in my procedural workflow. I'll probably put a link to that in the description. It's still in progress, so it's not available yet, but just to kind of see what I've been doing. Um, anyway, so for this tutorial, you won't need any of that. I'll show you how to make the nodes from that workflow in this that we will use in this tutorial. Um, and basically, these are spheres with a volumetric shader. And so let's kind of look at the overall node group. So we basically we modify our vectors so that vector inputs for a spherical texture so that we actually get it to distort in those really intricate shapes. We'll plug those into volume scatter, volume absorption, and an emission shader. And that's in a nutshell how it works. But we'll go into the details as we build it. So let's open up a brand new scene in Blender. Delete everything really, and just add in a sphere. Oops. If I go too fast or I do anything that you're not sure how I did with the nodes, it's because I'm using Node Wrangler add-on. It just does things really quickly, and I'll try to comment on everything I do there. So here's our sphere. We've opened the nodes, created a new material, and we'll start with a sphere texture. So Shift Add Texture, Gradient Texture, and change that to spherical. And I just Control Shift clicked on it. Node Wrangler is a built-in one, so you can just open your user preferences, add-ons, Node Wrangler, and just check that. Control Shift on anything will preview it. We want to see it volumetrically, so I just moved that to the volume, and this is what it looks like right now. The coordinates it's using are generated, but we don't want those. We want object coordinates, so just add a input texture coordinate node, plug in object into our vector, and now we have a sphere. Now the way this texture works is that it makes a gradient from 0 to 1. So if I add in, and I tend to search, so I'll try and work on that. So add math, and we want to only select greater value. So you can see it's 1 right at the center, and it fades off to 0 as we reach the edge. This is going to be important in a moment. So it's largest once it's a radius of 1, which is the same radius as our sphere, but we only want half of that. So basically we're selecting all values of this gradient texture where the radius is less than 0.5. So I hope that makes sense. Now we want to distort this texture. So the easiest way to do that is to somehow mess with the input vector. The way I like to do that is to use a noise texture. So texture, noise. And the reason I like the noise texture is that with the color input, if I change this back to surface, we have a bunch of colors. And each color can correspond to a different axis. RGB is X, Y, Z. So it needs a vector input, so we'll give it the object vector. And then we will add color mix RGB. We're going to add to our original vector this noise texture, and then if we preview that, you can see that we're distorting it some. This should be add, and now you'll notice that we're always distorting it to a certain direction. So what I like to do is actually subtract just a gray, so that when we distort, it just happens, it's centered along the original axis. So you can see how it distorts now compared to before, when it would actually shift the overall texture. Anyway, so this is how will distort our, excuse me, how we'll distort the vectors. So simple thing we can do now is make this into a group. So you select it, Control G. Now it's its own group. We can use this later on more easily. So I'm going to rename input to vector. The output should also be a vector. So you can just rename it vector. And then I'm going to plug in the scale, the detail, and the distortion, as well as the factor, so that we can just tweak things from outside. And you can kind of play with this and see how it looks. If we change the scale, the distortions are smaller. Distortion kind of gives it this streaky look. And then detail is how smooth or rough that distortion is. And then you can name it something you'll remember. I'm going to call it vector distort. And then push F if you want to keep it for later. Okay, so now let's look at what this is giving, what this has done to our original gradient texture. So here is, oops, preview, move this to volume. So if we mute our, if we just mute, or basically set the factor to 0, and we take a look at our spherical texture, it's just a sphere. If you increase that though, you can see it get wavy, and this is basically how the whole thing works, how I built these. So, and you can tweak these parameters as you like. Distortion will kind of give it a wavy look, but if you do that, you're going to want to drop the scale. You can get this wavy look, basically. So, and then you can change how wide that is by making this bigger or smaller. And that's pretty simple. So what's next? We have the basic formula, you can call it, for this. Now we need to actually start building the shaders. So we're going to need volume scatter, if I can find it. And I'm going to put this control into the density. It looks weird because we don't have any lamps. So let's add a lamp. Sun lamp is just fine for now. And I'm going to turn it a little bit so that we get a little bit of backlighting kind of. And then we might need it. No, I think this just needs to be denser. So we're going to add math, and then we're going to multiply our density by a large number, 30. That doesn't look bad. You can add an HDRI if you like. It might add a little bit of color, so I'm going to do that. The ones I'm using are by HDRI Haven. Every Friday they release a free one, so that's a good asset if you don't have any. I like this one, so I'm just gonna use this one. And then, but we don't want to get distracted by that, so I'm going to go to the render tab, film, and set it to transparent. Okay. If you don't like, if it adds too much color, you can always decrease its brightness, but I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave it as is. So that's our volume scatter. This we can retitle it to by going into the, you can always open this with N if you don't know where it went. And I'm going to label it density so I remember what it does. Yeah. So now we'll add another shader so that we can actually change its color. And that'll be a volume absorption. Density goes into density. We need to add these. If you're using Node Wrangler, you can just push Control plus, and we can just tweak the colors like so. A bluish color, brownish, any color you want. I'm going to leave it a little bit on the, I think it was fine originally, so I'm just going to bring this back to uh, 1. Oh, and you can always click and drag across multiple rows and set them all to be the same value, in case you didn't know. So we have the volume part. Now what about the lights? So we've built basically the main gray part. What about the cool glowy parts? Sorry for terminology if it's too childish. So we're going to copy our vector distort node, but we want it to be different. We don't want the... Actually, let's just copy the entire thing again. Just Control D. So, but we don't want it to use the same vector. Otherwise, it'll glow exactly where it's got the smoky thing. And then it's going to be really even all along. So simplest way to change that is just to add a vector mapping node and just to move it along the z-axis a lot. I moved it 50. You don't need to go that far. It's really up to you in the end. I'm going to preview this again so that we know what we're looking at. Move it back to volume. And I don't see anything. Why? Oh, no, we can't add a bunch. I've messed up. Okay. We're going to have to... Sorry, I forgot. Because of the sphere gradient centers at 0, 0, 0, we can't just raise the texture by 50, because then we don't have the center of the sphere anymore. So we'll have to vary things up differently. We can just change these parameters here, actually. We will look at this one. Okay, just because this makes it way too bright. We can actually just delete that for now, because this is not the smoke. This is going to be the emission. So change up the parameters some, make it interesting. I think I'm going to give it interesting. Just make it different. So we have this, and then we have this. If they're different, then this will work fine. Now we want an emission shader. And then just plug basically the output of our texture into the shader. Change the emission to volume. Okay, so now what? We can change the color, but having one color all the way through, it could look nice, but I personally find it a little boring. So what we can do is use the radius from the original, yeah, basic, because this original gradient texture gave us the radius of the whole thing. So we can use that to drive, we can plug that into a color ramp. So color ramp, and if you're not sure how I'm doing that, just add, and then just click search. I just find it a lot faster. And change, and set the colors to be whatever you want. I'm going to go with, which one do I like the most? I think I like the blue one. I'll do blue. Or do something new. I'll stick with blue. Or blue to green. And now we'll just plug that into the color, and then preview that again, change it to volume, and then you can always tweak this as you want. I'm going to, since we only want values that are greater than 0.5, there's no point in spending a lot of our radius. I'm not sure if that makes sense. We're only looking at values from 0.5 to 1. So anything so the only colors that get used are these ones here, because this is radius 0.5 all the way to 1. You can drag this over here, or to keep the two separate color and just kind of remapping the values, just so that you can set the color from 0 to 1 and not have to worry about this. You can just set this to 0.5. And now this 0.5 or 0 is actually shifted 0.5 over, so that we actually get the whole gradient. And like there's so you can see you have the whole gradient. Okay, so there's our colors. We have this. Now we just need to add the two. So Control plus, and now we have something interesting. I think that this should be a lot brighter. So I'm going to converter, math, add, or not add, but multiply. 30. That might be a little too much. 5. And then if you have it set up, you can switch to Filmic. I'm going to do that now because it looks nicer. And then look, base contrast. Okay. And if you don't know about Filmic Blender, you can just look it up. There's a lot of things online. Yeah, and now we can change how far the emission spreads is basically. Larger numbers means there's only a little bit will peek out. Small numbers means we'll have a lot of the glow. I think 0.6 is decent. I might want a bit more smoke, so I'll lower this so that we have more smoke. It's a little counterintuitive, but you get used to it. And now I do want to change the color of the smoke, or at least make it darker. So, making it darker. And that's the basic idea of how you put together this shader. I just had different parameters there. Let's actually see what I used originally. Scale of 1, detail 5, distortion 5, and then 225. So 155, 1, 5, and 5. And I think I had smoked those a bit denser, but I do not remember. I could check, but okay. And now a lot of it is really the lighting. So I'm going to move this lamp around. We could make it a little darker. So front view again. So now it's more backlit, so we get more shadows. If you want the shadows to be sharper, you can just in the lamp settings lower the size, and it'll give you sharper shadows. And you can just tweak these settings as you like. So another question is, how did I get the green to swirl like this, or the purple to swirl like that? And I did that using another vector modifier, as I'm going to call them. I used a different one. And that basically twists the vector. And so we'll make that in a moment. Just this color here is bothering me. Too much blue. So I'm going to make it red. Come on. Okay. I'm going to make it a bit brighter. And if you want to get some of the light to actually transmit through the volume, it doesn't do that automatically. Not if the volume itself is emitting it. You have to go down to where do you have to go? Light paths, and then go and increase the volume bounces. Now this will add a lot of noise, and that's why this one has an absurd amount of noise. But I only use 64 samples, so yeah. But keep that in mind. This will add a bunch of noise. So I want this to be brighter. So I'm going to increase that to maybe 20, 50. I think I want a bit more of it. There. Okay. That's looking nice. Did we make this darker? You can also separate the density if you don't want the volume scatter and volume absorption to be controlled by the same density, you can just duplicate it. I use Shift D or Control Shift D to maintain this original link, and now you can tinker with them separately. I think I like how this looks right now. Okay, so now to twisting this this smoke. Before I move on, I don't like that I'm not getting nice shadows, so I'm going to change the light. We can tinker with lighting later. Okay, so we want to twist it. So I'm just going to preview this on a new material with the same object. It's fine. Actually, no, I'm going to use a cube. They're a bit nicer to see the way the vectors work just because it's a cube. So add a cube. You can do this on your sphere if you want. I just want to help make this clear. So we have we don't need the diffuse. Let's bring back our texture coordinates. And I want to look at the object coordinates. So when if you want to twist the vector, we need to basically rotate the vector at a different amount at varying. Okay, so to twist a vector, you want to rotate the vector around a particular axis, but you want to rotate it at different strengths depending on how far along the axis you've gone. So first you need to be able to rotate the vector and actually have that as a node that you can mess with. The built-in, where is it? The built-in mapping node isn't nice because you can't actually change these values as an input on a node. So that's a little disappointing, but we can easily remake, well, not maybe easily, but we can remake it. So I'm just going to open, I've already made one, so I'm just going to display that and let you guys, if you want to just kind of copy it, vector rotate X. It's the same for really X, Y, and Z. You just have to change what you're plugging in. And let's unhide everything. Okay, so this is the basic formula. I'm not sure if it's very easy to see. You can pause it right here, or after I'm done moving things. I might actually just switch to another theme for a moment. Maybe it's easier to see. No. Okay, maybe that's a little easier. Maybe not. There. Okay, that's just a reroute node over there. So you can pause it right here if you want to recreate it. And then just tweak. Oops. So shift. Anyway, so you just change, you just swap the X's, the Y's, and the Z's depending on which axis you want to rotate along. Okay, so I'm assuming you've put it together. Yeah, that's that. So if you have, I'm just going to append that group. Okay, vector rotate. So now we have our vector which will rotate it. So if you change the angle, so let's say 90 degrees, you could see how we are rotating the vector. Helps maybe if I do this. So we are rotating the vector. Okay, cool. Now what? We want to change how much we're rotating it depending on how far along that axis we've traveled. So this one, the one you guys just copied, rotates along the x-axis. So the farther we are along the x-axis, the more we want to twist it, or the more we want to rotate. So in converter, separate x, y, z, and then plug in the object coordinates, and we can see there's our x. Now if we plug the x right into the angle, this should do what we want, and you can tell that it kind of does, but it's not very noticeable, so you can always multiply it, add converter, math, multiply it, 50, and now you can see we have some twisting. It might not be as clear like this, but you can tell. So one, as you increase it, you can see this start to twist. So we can make this into a group as well. Control G. Oops. Let's try and make this just one. Okay, now we will select it. Control G. That's a vector. This is a vector. We want this parameter as an input, just so that we can choose how much we're twisting. Rename it maybe to twisting. And then you can always tab in and out of a node group if you're not sure how you get out. Yeah, and then just rename this maybe vector distortion or vector twisting, because we already made a vector twisting. And now we can go back to our sphere, which is on layer 1, and if we give it our original material, we can now shift add group. Now you won't have this many. I just imported all my procedural groups, so there's a lot. So I'm just going to search for it. Vector twisting, and just put that right there. And now we've automatically started twisting. In this case, the smoke. So you can make this even more, and you can, it gets fairly obvious that you are twisting it. Once we get more samples in. So if you want to go really crazy, you could go to like 500, and you can see the same thing you could see here, only it's we've twisted on the x-axis instead of the z. Easiest way to change that axis would be just to add in the vector mapping node from before. Vector mapping, and just to rotate that along the y 90 degrees. And now you have it twisting along the z-axis. You could do the same thing with your flames, if you want to term it that. Just duplicate and put it in here. And now we have an interesting result. We're twisting the flames in one direction and the smoke in another. You can always reduce the twisting if it's too much for you. It's all up to you. You can have them twist in the same direction, and you can get some pretty cool results. You can play around with colors. Just play around with all the settings really that we have here. But in a nutshell, that's how you do it. And then what's left but the lighting? Where is surface? You can turn off your HDRI if you made one and not sure you like it. Change how strong it is. I think the HDRI was a little too strong because I didn't like the shadows were so soft. And since the HDRI is very blue, I'm going to give our sun lamp a little bit of yellow and maybe make it brighter. And there you have it. Or maybe it's too bright. But really, that's all you're going to end up doing now, is just tweaking it until you're happy with how it looks. So, I'll give you, just before I close, the full screenshot of our node tree. we can ignore the mapping node. We know it's there. Ta-da! So let me know in the comments if you liked it, if you want me to do more stuff. I might, I'm not sure yet. I might even just have time lapses of me putting together some of my procedural, um, using my procedural workflow, and maybe get critique on that until I'm ready to release it. But until then, have a good time and enjoy.